Right now you're probably sitting in a building. Maybe it's your home, maybe an apartment, maybe a house you own. There are walls around you, a roof over your head, electricity flowing through wires, water in pipes. You've got a refrigerator full of food that you bought from a store. Outside your window there's probably a road, maybe some street lights, other buildings, the infrastructure of civilization. This is so normal to you that you barely think about it. But here's something that should absolutely blow your mind. For 290,000 years, humans lived without any of this. No buildings, no farms, no cities, no civilization, nothing. Just small groups of people wandering across the landscape, hunting animals, gathering plants, sleeping under the stars or in temporary shelters, moving constantly, never settling down. For nearly 300,000 years, this was the only way humans knew how to live, and they were good at it. They survived ice ages, they crossed continents, they adapted to deserts and forests and mountains and coastlines. They had language, they had culture, they made art, they buried their dead. They were fully modern humans in every biological sense. But they never built anything permanent. Then, around 12,000 years ago, everything changed. And I mean everything. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye on the scale of human history, people started settling down. They started planting seeds and growing crops. They started domesticating animals. They started building permanent structures, not just for living in, but massive stone temples that required hundreds of people working together. Within just a few thousand years, humans went from nomadic hunter-gatherers to farmers living in villages. Then those villages became towns. Those towns became cities. Those cities became civilizations with writing, mathematics, complex social hierarchies, specialized professions, trade networks spanning thousands of miles. All of this happened so fast it's almost impossible to comprehend. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all at once. So here's the mystery that keeps archaeologists and anthropologists arguing to this day. Why? Why did this happen when it did? For 290,000 years, humans were perfectly successful as nomadic hunter-gatherers. There was no biological change in our brains. We didn't suddenly get smarter 12,000 years ago. Humans from 50,000 years ago had the same cognitive abilities we have today. They could have built civilizations, but they didn't. They just kept wandering, kept hunting and gathering, kept living the way their ancestors had lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, around 10,000 BCE, almost simultaneously across multiple continents, people independently started doing something completely different. In the Middle East, they're domesticating wheat and barley. In China, they're cultivating rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, they're growing squash and maize. In the Andes, they're planting potatoes. These people had no contact with each other. They were separated by thousands of miles of ocean and land. Yet they all started settling down and farming within a few thousand years of each other. This is not normal. This is deeply weird. Something happened 12,000 years ago that triggered the most dramatic transformation in human history. But what? Some scientists point to climate change. Around 11,600 years ago, the last ice age ended, and Earth entered a period called the Holocene. Temperatures warmed up, weather patterns became more stable, and suddenly conditions were perfect for agriculture. But here's the problem with that explanation. There had been other warm periods between ice ages. Why didn't humans start farming during those earlier warm periods? Other researchers believe something more dramatic happened. They point to evidence of a cosmic impact, maybe a comet or asteroid that slammed into Earth's ice sheets around 12,800 years ago. This would have triggered massive floods, climate chaos, and the extinction of many large animals that humans had relied on for food. Maybe humans were forced to find new ways to survive. Maybe that catastrophe pushed us toward agriculture and settlement. Then there are the archaeologists who look at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex built by hunter-gatherers 11,600 years ago, before they even started farming. This suggests maybe the social and cognitive revolution came first. Maybe humans developed new religious beliefs, new ways of organizing large groups, new reasons to stay in one place, and agriculture followed from that. The truth is, nobody knows for sure. After decades of research, thousands of excavations, analysis of ancient DNA, climate records trapped in ice cores, we still don't have a complete answer to why humans suddenly stopped wandering and started building civilizations 12,000 years ago. But we're getting closer, and the story that's emerging is more fascinating than anyone imagined. It involves cosmic catastrophes, climate upheaval, extinct megafauna, mysterious temples, the birth of religion as we know it, and a cascade of changes that transform not just how humans lived, but how we thought about ourselves and our place in the world. This is the story of the most important turning point in human history, the moment when we stopped being part of nature and started trying to control it, the moment when civilization began. So let's talk about what your ancestors were actually doing for the 290,000 years between when anatomically modern humans appeared and when civilization suddenly erupted onto the scene. Because here's what's wild. Around 300,000 years ago in Africa, a new kind of human evolved, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern. If you could dress one up in contemporary clothes and put them on a subway, nobody would look twice. Same brain size as us, same body proportions, same vocal anatomy capable of complex language. By every physical measure, these were modern humans, and then they just wandered around for 290,000 years. They didn't build cities, they didn't plant crops, they didn't establish kingdoms or write laws or construct monuments. They lived in small groups, followed animal herds, gathered plants, and moved with the seasons. For almost 300 millennia, this was the entire human story. Nomadic hunter-gatherers doing what their ancestors had done, what their children would do, what everyone assumed their descendants would always do. Now, before you start thinking this was some kind of primitive existence, some desperate struggle to survive until civilization could rescue them, let me tell you something that might surprise you. Hunter-gatherer life was actually pretty good. Modern anthropologists who study the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies, groups that maintained this lifestyle into the 20th and 21st centuries, have discovered something remarkable. These people work about 15 to 20 hours per week. That's it. The rest is leisure time, socializing, storytelling, playing games, creating art, sleeping. Compare that to the average agricultural peasant who works dawn to dusk most days of the year. Or to you, presumably working 40-plus hours a week at a job you might not even like. The hunter-gatherers were taking it easy. Their diet was incredibly diverse. Depending on the region and season, they might eat 50 to 100 different plant species, plus whatever game they could hunt or fish they could catch, nuts, berries, roots, tubers, fruits, seeds, leaves, mushrooms, eggs, honey, shellfish, birds, large mammals, small mammals, insects. The variety protected them from nutritional deficiencies and made them resilient when specific food sources failed. Skeletal evidence shows they were generally healthier than early farmers. Taller on average, fewer signs of disease, better teeth. The diversity of their diet and the mobility of their lifestyle meant they didn't suffer from the epidemic diseases that would later plague dense agricultural settlements, and the social bonds were extraordinary. These were tight-knit groups of 25 to 50 people, usually extended family units where everyone knew everyone else intimately. Children were raised communally, with multiple adults involved in care and education. Knowledge was shared freely. Resources were distributed according to need, not accumulated by individuals. The old, the sick, the disabled were cared for. We have archaeological evidence of this. Skeletons of individuals who survived serious injuries or illnesses that would have been debilitating, who lived years or even decades after trauma that should have killed them. Someone was feeding them, protecting them, keeping them alive. This was cooperation at its finest. But let's also talk about the world they were living in. Because 290,000 years ago, and for most of the time since, Earth was locked in an ice age. Not the frozen wasteland you might be imagining, but a planet significantly colder than today. Average global temperatures were 4 to 7 degrees Celsius cooler than modern times. What does that mean practically? It means ice sheets up to 2 miles thick covering Canada, Scandinavia, and parts of northern Asia. It means sea levels 120 meters lower than today because all the water was locked up in glaciers. Coastlines looked completely different. The English Channel was a river valley. The Persian Gulf was dry land. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia. You could walk from Siberia to Alaska across the Bering Land Bridge. And the wildlife? Absolutely incredible. This was the age of megafauna, woolly mammoths roaming the northern steppes in herds that could number in the thousands, giant ground sloths in the Americas the size of elephants, dire wolves hunting in packs across the plains, cave bears in Europe that outweighed modern grizzlies, saber-toothed cats, giant short-faced bears, glyptodons, which were basically Volkswagen-sized armadillos. Australia had marsupial lions and 3-metre-tall kangaroos. New Zealand had moas, flightless birds that stood twice the height of a human. Ireland had elk with antlers spanning 12 feet. Every continent except Antarctica was teeming with massive animals that would seem like fantasy creatures to us today. And your ancestors hunted them. Not constantly, not as their primary food source in most regions, but often enough that we find the evidence everywhere. Mammoth kill sites with stone tools still embedded in bones, cave paintings showing intimate knowledge of these animals' anatomy and behavior, entire ecosystems shaped by human hunting pressure. But hunting big game wasn't the main event. It was dangerous, unpredictable, sometimes days or weeks between successful kills. The real foundation of the hunter-gatherer diet was gathering, and it wasn't random foraging, it was systematic, scientific, based on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Your ancestors knew their territories intimately. They could identify hundreds of plant species by sight. They knew which ones were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They knew when each plant would fruit or when roots would be most nutritious. They understood animal migration patterns, knew where herds would be in each season. They could read weather signs, predict when rivers would flood, sense when storms were coming. This knowledge wasn't written down. It couldn't be. Writing wouldn't be invented for another 295,000 years. Instead, it was transmitted orally, embedded in stories, songs, rituals. An elder teaching a child which mushrooms were safe wasn't just sharing facts. They were passing down knowledge refined over thousands of generations, tested by life and death, proven by survival. And here's what's remarkable. These people weren't just surviving. They were creating sophisticated culture. We know this because they left evidence that still stuns us today. Cave paintings from sites like Chauvet in France, created 36,000 years ago, show artistic sophistication that rivals anything produced by trained modern artists. These aren't crude stick figures. They're dynamic compositions using shading, perspective, and movement. The artists understood proportion, anatomy, even how to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. Ritual burials appear in the archaeological record going back at least 100,000 years. Bodies carefully positioned, sometimes covered in red ochre, accompanied by grave goods, shell beads, stone tools, flowers, evidence of belief in something beyond immediate survival, evidence of love, grief, hope for an afterlife. Long-distance trade networks emerged early. We find shell jewellery hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean, obsidian tools made from volcanic glass transported across vast distances, amber from the Baltic showing up in Mediterranean sites. These weren't just random wanderings. This was systematic exchange, relationships maintained across generations, value systems sophisticated enough to enable complex negotiations between groups who might meet only once every few years. Musical instruments appear surprisingly early. Bone flutes from 40,000 years ago with carefully drilled holes positioned to produce specific notes. These people were making music, probably singing, definitely dancing, creating beauty for its own sake, and they were doing all this while living in small mobile groups. Bands of 25 to 50 people moving seasonally, following resources, maybe 100 to 150 individuals in a regional network of related bands who had come together for ceremonies, marriages, trade, but never settling permanently, never staying in one place long enough to build anything that would last millennia. Because here's the thing about the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. It was flexible. If resources in one area declined, you moved. If conflict arose with neighbours, you moved. If disease struck, you moved. Mobility was your insurance policy against disaster. Stay light, stay mobile, stay ready to adapt. That's how you survived ice ages and climate fluctuations and volcanic eruptions and all the other challenges that the Pleistocene threw at humanity. And it was sustainable. Hunter-gatherers lived in equilibrium with their environment. They couldn't overexploit resources because they had to come back to the same territories year after year, take too many animals, cut down too many trees, and next season there would be nothing. Natural selection favoured conservation. Groups that managed resources wisely survived. Those that didn't went extinct. Population density remained low. Maybe one person per square kilometre in good territories, much less in marginal areas. This prevented the spread of epidemic diseases, reduced conflict over resources, and ensured that even basic technologies could provide abundant food. So why did this lifestyle persist so long? If civilization is supposedly better, if agriculture and cities and writing and complex societies represent progress, why did it take 290,000 years for humans to figure this out? Here's the paradox that nobody talks about. Maybe our ancestors didn't need to change. Maybe they looked at their lives, working 15 hours a week, eating diverse diets, living in tight-knit communities with strong social bonds, and thought, why would we want anything different? Think about it from their perspective. Agriculture, when it finally emerged, was hard work. Longer hours, more intensive labour, repetitive tasks. The diet became less diverse, dominated by whatever crops you could grow. You couldn't just move if things went wrong. You were tied to your fields, your stored grain, your investment of time and labour. And early agricultural settlements were disease factories. Dense populations, domesticated animals living alongside humans, waste accumulation, contaminated water supplies. Life expectancy actually dropped when humans adopted agriculture. People got shorter, sicker, died younger. So from a hunter-gatherer perspective, civilization wasn't obviously better. It was just different. More work, more risk, less freedom, worse health. Why would you volunteer for that? The answer, as we'll see, is that they didn't volunteer. Not really. Something happened that made the hunter-gatherer lifestyle suddenly unsustainable. Something forced humanity to change or die, and that something came from space. But before we get to that cosmic catastrophe, understand this. Your ancestors lived for 290,000 years in small bands, moving with the seasons, sharing knowledge and resources, creating art and music, telling stories under starlit skies. They weren't waiting for civilization. They weren't stumbling in darkness until agriculture could enlighten them. They were living exactly the way humans evolved to live, and they were pretty damn good at it. The world they knew was about to end. Not slowly, not with warning, but in a single catastrophic night that would change the course of human history forever. For 290,000 years, your ancestors had been perfecting the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They'd survived ice ages, volcanic winters, droughts, and every other catastrophe the planet could throw at them. They'd developed sophisticated tools, complex languages, intricate social networks. They'd spread across the entire globe, from the southern tip of Africa to the frozen shores of the Arctic, from the deserts of Australia to the forests of South America. They were good at what they did, really good, so good that there seemed to be no reason for them to ever change. Then, around 10,800 BCE, something happened that would alter the course of human history forever. Something that would force our species to fundamentally reimagine how to survive on this planet. The planet had been warming nicely for several thousand years. The last ice age was retreating. Glaciers that had covered half of North America and Europe were melting. Sea levels were rising. Forests were expanding into territories that had been frozen tundra for 100,000 years. Life was getting easier. Food was becoming more abundant. Human populations were growing. And then, in what might have been a matter of days or weeks, everything changed. The evidence is written in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment layers from lakes across the northern hemisphere, in the geological record of dozens of countries. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth's climate didn't just cool down, it collapsed. Within a human lifetime, maybe within a single generation, temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted. The warming trend that had been gradually melting the Ice Age glaciers reversed completely. The world plunged back into deep freeze conditions that would last for 1,200 years. Scientists call this the Younger Dryas period, named after a hardy Arctic flower that suddenly appears in the pollen record across Europe during this time. But that sterile scientific name doesn't capture the sheer terror of what happened. Imagine you're living in what is now France or Germany or Britain. For your entire life, for your parents' and grandparents' lives, the climate has been getting warmer and wetter. The old stories tell of times when ice covered everything, but those are ancient history. Your world is green and abundant. Then one summer, the warmth doesn't come. The next year is even colder. Within a decade, the forests you've relied on for game and plant foods are dying. The herds of animals your people have hunted for generations are moving south, dying off, or changing their migration patterns completely. Rivers that ran year-round are freezing solid in winter. Springs and summers that used to bring reliable food resources become brief and unpredictable. This wasn't a gradual change your people could adapt to slowly. This was catastrophic, immediate, and it affected the entire Northern Hemisphere simultaneously. For over a century, mainstream archaeology has explained the Younger Dryas as a purely terrestrial event. The most accepted theory involved fresh water from melting Ice Age glaciers disrupting the Atlantic Ocean's circulation patterns, shutting down the Gulf Stream, causing rapid cooling. It's a neat explanation. It involves known processes. It doesn't require anything extraordinary. But here's the thing. The evidence for what actually triggered the Younger Dryas has been hiding in plain sight for decades, and it suggests something far more dramatic. Something that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone who witnessed it. In the 1960s and 70s, geologists started noticing something strange in sediment cores from across North America. At the exact geological moment when the Younger Dryas began, there was a distinctive black layer, not just in one place, but across the entire continent. From California to the Carolinas, from Mexico to Canada, this black mat layer appeared with remarkable consistency. At first, nobody knew what to make of it. Some thought it was just organic material that had accumulated during a period of environmental change. But then researchers started looking more closely at what was actually in this black layer. And what they found was disturbing. The layer contained massive amounts of charcoal, not just scattered fire debris from occasional wildfires, but concentrated carbon consistent with continent-wide burning. It contained microscopic spherules, tiny glass beads that form when rocks and soil are subjected to temperatures over 2,200 degrees Celsius. It contained nanodiamonds, carbon structures that only form under extreme pressure and heat. And perhaps most tellingly, it contained a platinum anomaly. Concentrations of platinum and other rare elements that are virtually absent from Earth's surface, but common in asteroids and comets. Then, in 2007, a team of scientists led by Richard Firestone dropped a bombshell. They proposed that the Younger Dryas hadn't been triggered by ocean circulation changes at all. It had been triggered by a cosmic impact. Specifically, they suggested that around 12,800 years ago, fragments of a comet had exploded in Earth's atmosphere over North America, triggering the catastrophic events that plunged the world back into Ice Age conditions. The hypothesis was immediately controversial. Mainstream archaeologists and geologists pushed back hard. Where was the impact crater? If something big enough to cause global climate change had hit Earth, surely it would have left a massive hole in the ground. The proponents had an answer. It didn't need to create a crater. If the object exploded in the atmosphere, like the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908, it could have released devastating energy without ever actually hitting the ground. Or, if fragments did strike the surface, they might have hit the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier covering North America at the time. An impact on 2 miles of ice wouldn't leave a crater in bedrock. It would create a temporary hole in the ice that would close up as the glacier moved and eventually melted away. But it would still have catastrophic effects. The energy released by such impacts would have been equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The heat would have triggered massive wildfires across the continent. The shock waves would have destabilized the ice sheet, potentially triggering massive meltwater floods. debris thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, triggering rapid cooling. The evidence started piling up. Researchers found the same black mat layer in Europe and Asia. They found the platinum anomaly at sites across the northern hemisphere. They found microspherules and nanodiamonds in sediments from a dozen countries. Most dramatically, they found evidence of massive wildfires that had burned simultaneously across millions of square miles. And then there were the extinctions. At the exact moment the Younger Dryas began, North America lost 35 genera of large mammals. Mastodons, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, short-faced bears, all gone within a geological instant. Europe and Asia lost many species too, though not quite as dramatically. Traditional explanations blamed human hunting, overkill by the expanding human population. But the timing was too precise. These animals had survived previous climate changes, previous encounters with human hunters. Why would they all suddenly go extinct at exactly the moment the climate catastrophically shifted? The impact hypothesis provided an answer. The cosmic airburst and subsequent environmental catastrophe would have killed many animals directly through fire and blast effects. But more importantly, it would have destroyed their food sources. The massive wildfires would have eliminated vegetation across vast areas. The rapid climate shift would have disrupted ecosystems before they could adapt. But the most compelling evidence came from human archaeology. In North America, the Younger Dryas boundary marks the sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture. These were the most successful big-game hunters the continent had ever seen. They'd developed sophisticated stone spear points and had spread across the entire continent in just a few centuries. Their distinctive tools show up at archaeological sites from Alaska to Mexico. Then, at the Younger Dryas boundary, Clovis sites just stop. Not gradually, not with signs of cultural evolution, but abruptly. The distinctive Clovis points disappear from the archaeological record. When new human cultures emerge centuries later, they're completely different, with different tool technologies, different hunting strategies, different lifestyles. Something had broken the Clovis culture so completely that it never recovered. The impact hypothesis suggests what that something might have been. Imagine you're a member of a Clovis hunting band. Your people have been successfully hunting mammoths and other megafauna for generations. Then one day, the ski lights up brighter than the sun. Shock waves flatten forests for hundreds of miles. Fire rains from the sky. Within days, the landscape you've known your entire life is a smoking wasteland. The survivors would have been scattered, traumatized, separated from their traditional territories and resources. The animals they'd specialized in hunting would have been dying or migrating in panic. The plants they'd relied on for supplementary food would have been destroyed by fire. This is disaster archaeology. This is what happens when everything a culture depends on is suddenly destroyed. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while the Younger Dryas was catastrophic, while it killed millions of animals and probably millions of people, while it plunged human survivors back into desperate conditions reminiscent of the ancient genetic bottleneck, it also did something remarkable. It forced innovation. Think about it. For 290,000 years, humans had been successful hunter-gatherers. So successful that there was no pressure to change, no reason to experiment with fundamentally different survival strategies. Hunting and gathering worked. Why would you invest time and energy into something as labor-intensive and uncertain as trying to cultivate wild plants? But when the Younger Dryas hit, traditional hunting and gathering stopped working. The megafauna were gone. The reliable plant resources were destroyed or disrupted. The climate had become unpredictable, with wild swings from year to year that made traditional seasonal rounds impossible. Suddenly, experimentation wasn't just interesting, it was necessary. Humans who could figure out new food sources, who could develop new technologies, who could organize their communities in new ways, those humans survived. The others didn't. And here's where we start seeing the first evidence of something revolutionary. In the Middle East, in the region archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, human groups started doing something they'd never done before. They started deliberately planting wild grains, not farming yet, not true agriculture, but proto-cultivation, taking seeds from the wild grasses they'd been collecting and planting them in favourable locations. Why? Because the Younger Dryas had made traditional food gathering unreliable. The wild stands of wheat and barley were smaller, less predictable. But if you saved seeds and planted them near your camp, you could create your own supply. It was more work than traditional gathering, but it was more reliable. At the same time, humans were starting to build permanent structures. Not simple shelters that could be abandoned when the group moved on, but substantial buildings made of stone. Buildings that represented enormous investments of labour. Buildings that implied their creators were planning to stay in one place. The most spectacular example of this is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Built around 9600 BCE, right in the middle of the Younger Dryas period, this site features massive T-shaped pillars carved from bedrock and arranged in circular structures. Some of these pillars weigh 20 tons. Moving them and erecting them would have required coordinated labour from hundreds of people. And here's the stunning thing. There's no evidence of permanent habitation at Göbekli Tepe. No houses, no trash middens, no signs that people lived there year-round. Instead, it appears to have been a ceremonial centre, a place where scattered hunter-gatherer groups came together periodically for rituals, feasting, and probably also trade and social networking. Why would hunter-gatherers in the middle of a climate catastrophe invest this kind of effort into building a ceremonial complex? Some researchers think Göbekli Tepe was a response to the crisis itself, a way for scattered human groups to maintain connections in a world that had become dangerous and unpredictable, a physical symbol of cooperation and shared identity when the environment seemed to be actively trying to kill everyone. But building and maintaining a place like Göbekli Tepe would have created new pressures. You need to feed all those people when they gather. You need reliable food surpluses. And the most efficient way to create food surpluses is cultivation. Plant crops near the ceremonial centre. Tend them throughout the year. Use the harvest to support the gatherings. This might be why the world's first evidence of plant cultivation appears in the same region, at roughly the same time, as these massive ceremonial structures. The catastrophe created the pressure. The ceremonial centres created the opportunity, and cultivation was the solution. The debate over the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains fierce. Mainstream archaeology is conservative by nature, resistant to dramatic explanations when simpler ones might suffice. And there are legitimate questions. The evidence for cosmic impact is strong but not definitive. Some of the markers, like nanodiamonds, can form through other processes. The exact mechanism of the impact, whether it was multiple airbursts, surface impacts, or some combination, remains unclear. But recent years have seen the evidence mounting. In 2019, researchers confirmed a massive platinum anomaly in ice cores from Greenland, dated precisely to the Younger Dryas boundary. In 2020, geological surveys identified what might be impact structures beneath the Greenland ice sheet. In 2021, analysis of ancient pollen showed that North American forests burned simultaneously across the entire continent at the Younger Dryas boundary. Whether the trigger was cosmic impact or something else, the effects were undeniable. And those effects created the conditions that would fundamentally transform human society. The Younger Dryas didn't just change the climate, it changed human destiny. It took successful hunter-gatherers who had no reason to change their lifestyle and subjected them to pressures so intense that innovation became essential for survival. When the Younger Dryas finally ended around 9600 BCE, the humans who emerged from those 1,200 years of crisis were different from their ancestors. They had experimented with cultivation. They had built permanent structures. They had developed new forms of social organization to survive the catastrophe. They were ready to build civilization. They just didn't know it yet. But the Younger Dryas didn't just kill people and destroy ecosystems. It did something else, something that would prove even more important in the long run. It created the conditions for the most revolutionary transformation in human history: the invention of agriculture. Now here's the thing about agriculture. It wasn't invented, not really. Not in the way someone invents a wheel or discovers fire. It emerged, gradually, almost accidentally, in at least 7 different places around the world, developed by people who were desperate, hungry, and trapped between a catastrophic past and an uncertain future. The story begins in a place archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent. This arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and down into Egypt. Around 10,000 BCE, as the Younger Dryas was finally releasing its grip on the planet, this region had something special. It had wild wheat, wild barley, wild lentils and peas, and crucially, it had animals. Not just any animals, but species with very specific characteristics. They were herd animals, relatively docile, with flexible diets and social hierarchies that could be exploited by clever humans. Think about that combination. You've got wild grains that produce edible seeds in huge quantities. You've got animals that naturally cluster in groups and follow leaders. And you've got human populations that have just spent over 1,000 years watching their traditional food sources collapse. Populations that had developed increasingly sophisticated food processing techniques during the crisis. Populations that had learned to notice patterns, to experiment, to try anything that might keep their children alive. The wild wheat growing in the Fertile Crescent wasn't like modern wheat. The seeds were tiny, the stalks were irregular, and the seed heads shattered easily, scattering grain everywhere the moment it ripened. This was perfect for the plant's evolutionary strategy. Scatter your seeds far and wide. Let them find their own growing spots, but it was terrible for humans trying to harvest the grain. So here's what happened. Some groups started paying attention to the wheat fields during the Younger Dryas. When you're hungry enough, you notice everything. They noticed that some plants had slightly larger seeds. They noticed that some stalks were a bit easier to harvest because their seed heads didn't shatter quite as readily. And they started, probably without even thinking about it, selecting those plants. Maybe they harvested the good plants first, before the seeds scattered. Maybe they accidentally dropped some seeds near their camps where they grew the next year. Maybe they deliberately saved some seeds and scattered them in convenient locations. Generation after generation, harvest after harvest, this unconscious selection continued. Humans weren't trying to breed better wheat. They were just harvesting the grain that was easiest to collect. But from the plant's perspective, this was intense directional selection. Plants with larger seeds were more likely to be harvested, which meant more likely to be carried back to human camps, which meant more likely to have their seeds scattered in the disturbed nutrient-rich soil around human habitations. Within a few thousand years, wild wheat had transformed into something that couldn't survive without human help. These seed heads no longer shattered. The seeds had become too large and heavy to be carried by wind. The plants had become domesticated, evolutionary adapted to human cultivation. The same process was happening with barley, with lentils, with peas and chickpeas. But the real game changer was animals. Wild sheep roamed the hills of the Fertile Crescent in large herds. They were prey animals, nervous and quick to flee, but they had one crucial characteristic. They followed dominant individuals. Control the leader, control the herd. Some human groups started following these herds more systematically during the Younger Dryas, not just hunting them occasionally, but tracking them, protecting them from other predators, maybe even guiding them toward better grazing areas. The sheep that were less fearful of humans survived better because the humans were actually providing protection and predictable grazing. Over generations, the sheep that tolerated human presence most calmly were the ones most likely to survive and reproduce. Natural selection was turning wild animals into domestic livestock. Sheep, then goats, then pigs, eventually cattle, each species going through the same transformation. Wild, independent animals becoming docile, dependent partners in an interspecies relationship that would reshape the entire planet. And here's where it gets wild. This wasn't just happening in the Fertile Crescent. Around the same time, completely independently, people in at least 6 other places around the world were starting the same process. In China, they were domesticating rice and millet, pigs and chickens. In Mesoamerica, they were working with maize, beans and squash. In the Andes, they were breeding potatoes and llamas. In sub-Saharan Africa, they were cultivating sorghum and millet. In New Guinea, they were developing agriculture based on taro and yams. In eastern North America, they were domesticating local seed plants like sunflowers and goosefoot. 7 independent inventions of agriculture, all emerging within a few thousand years of each other, all in the aftermath of the Younger Dryas. This wasn't coincidence. This was desperation breeding innovation. All around the world, human populations that had lost their traditional food sources were experimenting with anything that might provide reliable calories, and in a few lucky places they found wild species that responded well to cultivation. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about the agricultural revolution. It wasn't an improvement. Not at first. Probably not for thousands of years. Think about what farming actually requires. You have to clear land. Backbreaking work with stone tools. You have to prepare soil, plant seeds, weed constantly, protect your crops from animals and insects. You have to harvest everything at the right time, process it, store it. The labor requirements are enormous, way more than hunting and gathering. The diet gets worse too. Hunter-gatherers ate a huge variety of foods: meat, fish, nuts, fruits, roots, seeds, dozens of different species depending on the season. Early farmers ate mostly wheat, or mostly rice, or mostly maize, whatever single crop they'd invested all their labor in. Nutritional diversity plummeted. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural populations shows the health consequences clearly. Average height decreased. Dental cavities skyrocketed from all those starchy grains. Nutritional deficiencies became common. Infectious diseases exploded because people were living in close proximity to their own waste. and to domestic animals that carried new pathogens. And then there's the freedom issue. Hunter-gatherers were mobile. If resources declined in one area, they moved. If a group leader became abusive, people could leave. If conflict arose, people could separate. Early farmers were trapped. You can't just abandon your fields after months of labor. You can't walk away from stored grain that represents your children's survival through winter. Agriculture created property, and property created prisons. Not literal prisons, not yet, but geographic and economic prisons that constrained human freedom in entirely new ways. So why did they keep doing it? Why didn't early farmers just give up and go back to hunting and gathering? Because they couldn't. Agriculture had sprung a trap, and once you were in it, there was no escape. Here's how the trap works. Farming produces more calories per acre than hunting and gathering. Not more calories per hour of labor. That's actually worse. But more total food from a given piece of land. This means farming communities could support higher population densities, more people living in the same space, which meant higher birth rates. Hunter-gatherer women typically have a child every 4 years because you can't carry more than one small child while maintaining a mobile lifestyle. Farming women could have children every 2 years because they weren't moving around constantly. So within a few generations, farming communities had populations that hunting and gathering simply couldn't support. You had more mouths to feed, which meant you needed to farm more land, which meant you needed more labor, which meant you needed more children to provide that labor. The cycle reinforced itself. Population growth forcing agricultural intensification, forcing more population growth. And if you tried to go back to hunting and gathering, the local wild resources couldn't support your enlarged population. You'd starve. The only way forward was more farming, better techniques, more land, higher yields. Agriculture became a treadmill that humans couldn't get off. But that treadmill did something revolutionary. It created surplus. Not for everyone, not at first, not consistently, but sometimes, in good years, farming communities produced more food than they needed for immediate survival, way more than any hunter-gatherer group ever could. And that surplus changed everything. Because surplus food means you can support specialists, people who don't farm. The first specialists were probably part-timers, someone who was particularly good at making pots, spending a bit of extra time on pottery, trading bowls for grain. Someone with skill at flint knapping, making tools for others. But as agricultural yields improved and surpluses grew larger, full-time specialization became possible. You could have people who just made tools, people who just made pottery, people who devoted themselves to studying the seasons and predicting the best planting times. These became the first priests, the first astronomers, claiming special knowledge about when to plant and when to harvest. And you needed people to organize the surplus, to decide how to store it, how to distribute it, who got what when times were hard. These became the first administrators, the first bureaucrats. You also needed people to protect the surplus. Because here's the thing about stored grain, it's stealable. Mobile hunter-gatherers don't have much worth stealing. You can't really steal someone's knowledge of where the best nut trees are. But stored grain, that's concentrated wealth. That's something worth fighting for. Early farming communities needed defenders, people who specialized in violence to protect the food stores from raiders. These became the first warriors, the first military class. Within a few thousand years of the first domestication, you had all the basic elements of civilization. Farmers producing surplus food, craftspeople making specialized goods, priests claiming spiritual authority, administrators organizing resources, warriors defending territory. All of these social roles emerging from that initial decision to cultivate wild wheat instead of just gathering it. But these social changes brought something else, something that humans had never really experienced before. Systematic inequality. Hunter-gatherer societies had some inequality. Some people had more prestige, more influence. But nobody could accumulate much wealth. You can only carry what you can transport. When you're mobile, you travel light. Farming changed that. Suddenly you could own land. You could store grain for years. You could accumulate wealth across generations. The administrator who controlled the grain stores could leverage that position into permanent power. The warrior who defended the village could demand a larger share of the harvest. The priest who claimed to speak for the gods could require offerings. Within a few generations, farming societies developed rigid hierarchies that would have been unthinkable to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. The archaeological record shows this clearly. Early farming villages show relatively equal house sizes, similar grave goods, little evidence of social stratification. But a few thousand years later, you start seeing big houses and small houses, elaborate graves filled with valuables next to simple graves with nothing, evidence of elites emerging, of some families accumulating wealth and power, while others fell into debt and dependence. And with inequality came violence, not just raiding or occasional conflicts like hunter-gatherers experienced, but systematic warfare, fighting over land, fighting over stored resources, fighting over water rights and trade routes. The first fortified villages appear in the archaeological record around 9,000 years ago. Walls built not against wild animals but against other humans. The first evidence of mass casualties from warfare shows up shortly after. Bodies with projectile wounds, evidence of organized violence between groups. Agriculture hadn't just changed how humans got food, it had changed what humans were. It had created property, wealth, inequality, and war. It had replaced the fluid, relatively egalitarian social structures of hunter-gatherers with rigid hierarchies of owners and workers, rulers and subjects, priests and peasants. But it had also created something else, the foundations for everything that would come after. Those storage technologies that farming required, learning to keep grain dry and safe from pests, that led to fermentation. Grain that got wet accidentally started the first beer, the first bread. These fermentation technologies would become crucial for food preservation and probably played a role in early social bonding, people gathering to drink together, creating the first taverns, the first public spaces. The surplus that agriculture created and the specialization it allowed meant humans could finally start building things that would last. Not just temporary camps, but permanent structures. Not just tools for immediate use, but monuments, temples, meeting halls. The first permanent architecture in human history appears right after agriculture, and with permanent structures came a whole new relationship with place. For the first time, humans could point to something they'd built and say, "This is ours, this is home, this is worth defending." This was the true revolution. Not just a new way of getting food, but a complete transformation of human society, human psychology, human relationships with each other and with the land. Agriculture turned humans from participants in nature to managers of nature. From people who followed the food to people who made the food come to them. From mobile bands with few possessions to settled communities with accumulated wealth, stored knowledge, specialized skills. All of this emerging in the immediate aftermath of the Younger Dryas. All of this developing within just a few thousand years. The speed of the transformation was unprecedented in human history. For 290,000 years, humans had lived essentially the same way, as mobile hunter-gatherers. Then in less than 10,000 years, in just a few hundred generations, everything changed, and there was no going back. The trap had sprung. The surplus had been created. The population had grown beyond what hunting and gathering could support. Humans had locked themselves into a new way of life, one that would lead directly to cities, states, empires, and everything that came after. But agriculture alone wasn't enough to create civilization. Something else had to happen first. Something that would bring people together in unprecedented numbers, that would teach them to cooperate on massive scales, that would give them reason to build monuments that could be seen for miles. That story begins in a place that shouldn't exist. A massive temple complex built by people who supposedly hadn't even invented farming yet. A place that would force archaeologists to completely rethink everything they thought they knew about the origins of civilization. But let's rewind for a moment, because to understand why everything exploded 12,000 years ago, we need to understand what happened to the planet itself. Around 11,700 years ago, the ice age that had dominated Earth for over 100,000 years was finally decisively ending. And when I say ending, I don't mean gradually fading away over millennia. I mean the climate transformed with breathtaking speed. Within a human lifetime, maybe 2 generations at most, the world became almost unrecognizable. Ice sheets that had covered entire continents for tens of thousands of years began collapsing. Not melting slowly, but actively disintegrating, sending massive floods of meltwater into the oceans. Sea levels rose catastrophically. In some places, the water climbed 120 meters higher than it had been during the glacial maximum. That's 400 feet, the height of a 40-story building. Imagine standing on a beach and watching the ocean rise 400 feet. Except you wouldn't be standing there watching, because that beach would be underwater, along with everything for miles inland. This flooding wasn't just dramatic, it was transformative. Vast areas of continental shelf that had been dry land for millennia suddenly vanished beneath the waves. Land bridges that had connected continents disappeared. The Bering Land Bridge between Asia and North America, gone. The connection between Britain and mainland Europe, severed. The shallow seas between Southeast Asian islands, flooded, turning one continuous landmass into an archipelago. And here's the thing that keeps archaeologists up at night. Those continental shelves weren't empty wasteland. They were prime real estate. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, coastal regions would have been some of the most productive environments on Earth. Estuaries, wetlands, river deltas, places teeming with fish, shellfish, waterfowl. The kinds of resource-rich environments where human populations naturally congregate. So when the seas rose, they didn't just flood empty beaches. They potentially drowned the archaeological evidence of advanced hunter-gatherer societies that might have been developing complex social systems for thousands of years. Any permanent structures they built, underwater, any evidence of trade networks, artistic traditions, technological innovations, scattered across ocean floors, buried under sediment, lost forever. This is what archaeologists call the missing evidence problem. We know humans lived on those continental shelves. We know they were using those resources. But we can't excavate sites that are 400 feet underwater without massive expense and technological challenges. So our picture of human development before 12,000 years ago is fundamentally incomplete. We're looking at a puzzle where someone removed half the pieces and threw them into the ocean. But while the rising seas were destroying evidence of the past, they were also creating opportunities of the future. Because the warming wasn't just about flooding, it was about transformation of entire ecosystems on a global scale. As the ice sheets retreated, they exposed enormous territories that had been locked in permafrost for millennia. In North America, Europe, and Asia, millions of square miles of new land became available. Not immediately habitable, but gradually transforming from barren tundra into grassland, then forest, then the complex mixed environments that could support dense human populations. The warming also shifted weather patterns dramatically. Rain belts that had been stuck in certain latitudes for tens of thousands of years suddenly moved. Deserts that had been expanding during the glacial period began shrinking. Rivers that had been seasonal trickles became permanent waterways. Lakes appeared in places that had been dust bowls for generations. And this is where things get really interesting. Because around 9000 BCE, about 11,000 years ago, the warming entered what scientists call the Holocene optimum. This was the sweet spot, the period when Earth's climate reached its most stable, most productive state in over 100,000 years. During the Holocene optimum, global temperatures were actually slightly warmer than they are today. Not catastrophically warmer, just enough to push the boundaries of habitability further north and south from the equator. But more importantly than the temperature itself was the pattern of that warmth. It was predictable. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the climate remained remarkably stable. For people who had spent their entire evolutionary history dealing with rapid, unpredictable climate swings, this stability was revolutionary. For the first time in human memory, the rains came at the same time each year. The rivers flooded on predictable schedules. The plants that produced edible seeds grew in the same places season after season. The animal migrations followed consistent routes. This predictability changed everything. Because when you know the rains are coming in 3 months, you can plan for them. When you know a particular grass produces seeds in a certain season, you can protect those plants, encourage them, maybe even deliberately scatter their seeds in favorable locations. When you know game animals will follow specific migration routes, you can build structures to intercept them, develop strategies to harvest them sustainably. The Holocene optimum turned the natural world from a chaotic, dangerous place where survival was a daily gamble into something approaching a reliable partner. Nature still had its variations, its good years and bad years, but the baseline was stable enough that humans could start making long-term plans. And nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in what we now call the Sahara Desert, because here's something that blows people's minds. 9,000 years ago, the Sahara wasn't a desert, it was green. Not just green at the edges, but deeply, profoundly, impossibly green throughout its vast interior. During the Holocene optimum, the African monsoon shifted northward, bringing summer rains deep into what is now the world's largest hot desert. Rivers flowed year-round through valleys that are now sand dunes. Lakes, some of them enormous, dotted the landscape. One of these ancient lakes, called Mega-Chad, covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea, the largest lake in the world today. The archaeological evidence from this period is stunning. Rock art showing giraffes, elephants, hippos, crocodiles, all living in the heart of the Sahara. Not at the edges, but hundreds of miles into what is now absolutely barren desert. Sites showing human settlements alongside these lakes, communities of fisher-hunters who are harvesting aquatic resources and developing pottery, building permanent structures, creating complex societies. This green Sahara lasted for thousands of years, long enough that multiple human populations moved into the region, adapted to its environments, developed distinct cultural traditions. And this creates one of the most fascinating theories in archaeology, something called the Sahara pump theory. The idea is this: climate in the Sahara region didn't just flip from wet to dry and stay that way, it oscillated. Periods of abundant rainfall alternating with periods of increasing drought, creating a kind of environmental bellows that pushed human populations together and apart across millennia. When the climate was wet and the Sahara was green, human populations would spread out across the region, following the resources, establishing territories in these newly habitable areas. Groups that had been living in crowded conditions along the Nile Valley or in coastal regions could expand into the interior, relieving population pressure, accessing new resources. But then, every few thousand years, the climate would shift. The monsoons would weaken, the rains would become less reliable, lakes would begin shrinking, rivers would become seasonal. And slowly, generation by generation, those populations would be forced back together, pushed toward the remaining permanent water sources. This is where it gets interesting. When populations are sparse and spread out, you don't need much social organization. Extended family groups can operate independently, managing their own affairs, avoiding conflict through simple geographic separation. But when populations get compressed into smaller areas around shrinking resources, you need something more sophisticated. You need rules about who gets to use which water sources. You need systems for resolving disputes without everyone killing each other. You need leadership structures, probably ritual practices that reinforce group identity, technological innovations that let you extract more resources from limited territories. In other words, you need the building blocks of civilization. And the Sahara pump would have created these pressure moments repeatedly, forcing social innovation again and again over thousands of years. Each time the climate dried out, populations would compress, develop new social technologies, create more complex organizational systems. Then when the rains returned and populations could expand again, they'd carry those innovations with them, spreading new ideas about social organization across the region. This might explain one of the great mysteries of early civilization. Why did complex societies seem to emerge in so many places at roughly the same time? The answer might be that climate oscillations were creating similar pressures across multiple regions, forcing parallel innovations in social organization. But it wasn't just the Sahara. The Holocene optimum created similar transformations worldwide. In the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent became genuinely fertile, with reliable rainfall supporting dense stands of wild wheat and barley. These weren't marginal plants that humans had to work hard to exploit. They were abundant, productive, basically asking to be harvested and eventually cultivated. In East Asia, the monsoon intensified, creating ideal conditions for rice cultivation in river valleys. In Mesoamerica, seasonal patterns stabilized enough that wild maize and squash could be systematically harvested and gradually domesticated. In the Andes, predictable growing seasons allowed experimentation with potato and quinoa cultivation at high altitudes. The same story played out in region after region. Climate stability creating conditions where long-term investment in land management made sense, where clearing a field or digging an irrigation channel would pay off not just for one season but for decades, where building a permanent structure could actually stay in one place, because you didn't have to follow migrating resources anymore. This is crucial. Because agriculture isn't just about planting seeds, it's about investment. Every hour spent clearing land, building irrigation works, or protecting growing crops is an hour not spent hunting or gathering immediate food. You only make that investment if you're confident the climate will remain stable enough that your crops will actually grow and you'll be able to harvest them. For 290,000 years, that confidence would have been misplaced. The climate was too unstable, too unpredictable. You could spend months preparing a field only to have the rains fail, or come at the wrong time, or bring floods instead of gentle watering. Under those conditions, staying mobile, following wild resources, remaining flexible was the smart survival strategy. But during the Holocene optimum, for the first time in human history, betting on climate stability was actually rational. The rains came, the seasons cycled predictably, the investment paid off, and once a few communities figured this out and started succeeding with early agriculture, the knowledge spread rapidly through those trade and kinship networks that humans had been building for hundreds of thousands of years. Regional variations in how this happened created different pathways to complexity in different areas. In the Middle East, abundant wild cereals led to grain-based agriculture and eventually cities sustained by wheat and barley cultivation. In East Asia, rice paddies required sophisticated water management, driving innovations in collective labor organization. In Mesoamerica, the domestication of maize took longer but eventually supported dense populations and monumental architecture. In the Andes, vertical zonation, exploiting different crops at different altitudes, created unique patterns of social organization. But underlying all these regional variations was the same fundamental change: climate stability, predictability, the ability to plan seasons, years, even generations in advance. For a species that had evolved under conditions of constant climate chaos, this stability was like suddenly being handed the cheat codes to survival. And your ancestors, remember, weren't starting from scratch. They were the descendants of populations that had survived the Toba supervolcanic eruption, the genetic bottleneck, the Younger Dryas impact. They carried survival technologies, social organizational skills, and cognitive abilities that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of crisis management. When the climate finally stabilized, they were ready. Not just ready, overqualified. It was like training for a marathon by running uphill through mud while carrying rocks, then suddenly being allowed to run on flat pavement in perfect weather. They didn't just succeed, they exploded. Within a few thousand years of the Holocene optimum beginning, agricultural societies had emerged on multiple continents. Within another few thousand years, those societies were building permanent settlements, developing pottery, creating trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. The foundations of civilization were being laid at unprecedented speed. And then, in one particular region, someone did something that would change the course of human history forever. They built a temple, not a house, not a storage facility, not a defensive wall. A temple, a massive, elaborate, deliberately constructed ritual center, requiring thousands of hours of coordinated labor. Before they had invented farming, before they had pottery, before they had metal tools. This is where our story takes its most unexpected turn. Now here's where everything we thought we knew about the rise of civilization gets turned completely upside down. For over a century, archaeologists had a nice, neat story about how civilization began. First, you settled down. Then you started farming. Then, once you had surplus food and leisure time, you built temples and monuments. Religion and monumental architecture were luxuries that came after you'd solved the basic problem of survival. Makes sense, right? Seems logical. You can't build pyramids when you're constantly moving around hunting gazelles. Except that's not what happened, not even close. In 1963, a team of archaeologists working in southeastern Turkey, in a region the locals call Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly to Potbelly Hill, started finding something that shouldn't exist. At first they thought it was just another Byzantine cemetery. Nothing special. They catalogued it and moved on. But in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt took another look at the site, and what he found there would completely rewrite our understanding of human history. Göbekli Tepe isn't a cemetery. It's a temple complex, a massive, sophisticated, deliberately constructed ceremonial centre built around 9600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. That's roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge. About 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. It's older than pottery, older than writing, older than the wheel. And here's the kicker. It was built by hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet domesticated a single plant or animal, people who were still living in temporary camps, following herds, gathering wild foods, people who, according to everything we thought we knew, shouldn't have been capable of building anything like this. But they did, and it's extraordinary. The site consists of at least 20 circular and oval structures, though only a fraction have been excavated so far. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there might be hundreds more underground, waiting to be discovered. Each structure is built around massive T-shaped limestone pillars. These aren't small stones. We're talking pillars that stand up to 18 feet tall and weigh up to 20 tons. 20 tons. That's the weight of about 3 African elephants. And these ancient humans were quarrying these stones from bedrock, transporting them to the site, and erecting them in precise circular arrangements. Without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, just stone tools, human muscle, and an absolutely insane level of determination. But it gets better. These pillars aren't just big rocks standing in circles. They're covered in elaborate carvings, reliefs of animals rendered with stunning artistic skill. Foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, gazelles, wild asses, all carved with such precision and attention to detail that you can identify the species. There are also abstract symbols that nobody has yet deciphered. Geometric patterns, H-shaped figures, circular designs that might represent celestial bodies or abstract concepts. And most intriguingly, the pillars themselves are anthropomorphic. They have arms carved into the sides, hands positioned at what would be the waist, and sometimes belts or clothing indicated by carved lines. These aren't just posts. They're stylized representations of beings, possibly gods, possibly ancestors, possibly some concept of the sacred that we can't fully understand from our modern perspective. The implications are staggering, because building something like this required organization on a scale that we never thought pre-agricultural societies could achieve. Let's think about the logistics for a moment. To quarry a 20-ton pillar from bedrock, you need specialized stone tools, an understanding of geology to find suitable stone, and dozens of workers coordinating their efforts. To transport it even a short distance, you need hundreds of people working together. Ropes, wooden rollers or sledges, an understanding of leverage and mechanical advantage. To erect it vertically and keep it stable, you need engineering knowledge, precise planning, and again, massive coordinated labour. And this isn't a one-time effort. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe contain multiple massive pillars arranged in circles, with smaller pillars forming walls between them. The entire complex would have required thousands of hours of labour from hundreds, possibly thousands of workers. Where did all these people come from? How were they organised? Who coordinated the effort? How were all these workers fed while they were building instead of hunting and gathering? These were supposedly mobile hunter-gatherers. small bands of 20 or 30 people who moved with the seasons, yet somehow they were capable of mobilizing labor forces that wouldn't look out of place building a medieval cathedral. This is what makes Göbekli Tepe so revolutionary. It proves that pre-agricultural people were capable of social organization and monumental construction that we never dreamed possible. They didn't need farming to create complex societies. They didn't need surplus food storage to support specialized workers. They were doing all of this while still living as mobile foragers. But why? That's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night. Why would hunter-gatherers invest so much time and energy into building something like this? What possible purpose could it serve? The traditional answer, civilization is built on agriculture, completely falls apart here. These people weren't farming yet. Analysis of plant and animal remains from Göbekli Tepe shows they were still hunting gazelles, wild sheep and wild cattle, still gathering wild grains and nuts. The domesticated plants and animals that would define the Neolithic revolution don't show up in this region for another 1,000 to 2,000 years. So the temple came first, the settlement came later. The whole sequence is backward. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who spent decades excavating the site until his death in 2014, proposed a theory that seemed crazy at first, but has gained widespread acceptance. He called it religion before agriculture. The idea is that shared belief systems, not economic necessity, drove the first major social transformations in human history. Think about it this way. You're living 11,600 years ago in southeastern Turkey. The Younger Dryas has just ended. The climate is warming again. Plant and animal populations are recovering. Life is getting easier after thousands of years of cold and scarcity. Your people have survived. And in that context, maybe you're feeling grateful. Maybe you're feeling like the forces that control the world, the animals you hunt, the rains that water the wild grains, the seasons that cycle predictably, deserve recognition, deserve honor. So you start gathering. Not all the time, but periodically. Special times of year, maybe associated with celestial events or seasonal migrations of the herds. Different bands of hunter-gatherers converge on a sacred location, and together you build something that honors the powers you believe govern your world. Maybe it starts small, a few standing stones, simple rituals, but over generations it grows. More pillars are added, more elaborate carvings, more complex ceremonies. The site becomes famous. Pilgrims travel from hundreds of miles away to participate in the festivals and rituals held there. And here's where it gets really interesting. When you bring together hundreds of people from different bands for these periodic gatherings, something else happens. Knowledge gets shared. Someone from one region knows a better technique for processing wild grains. Someone from another region has figured out how to make better cutting tools. Young people from different bands meet, fall in love, decide to join their groups through marriage. Trade networks form. Alliances are established. The periodic gatherings at the sacred site become the glue that holds together a much larger social network than any single band could maintain on its own. And maybe, just maybe, these periodic gatherings become so important that eventually people start asking, why travel hundreds of miles several times a year? Why not just stay here? Close to the sacred site, close to the center of our social world. So they start building more permanent structures, storage facilities for wild grains collected from the surrounding landscape. Gradually, someone figures out that if you deliberately plant some of those wild grains near your camp, you don't have to range as far to collect them. The first tentative steps toward agriculture, not because of necessity, but because of convenience. because they'd already decided to stay in one place for religious and social reasons. This theory flips the entire traditional narrative on its head. Instead of agriculture enabling religion, religion enabled agriculture. Instead of surplus food enabling monumental architecture created the social conditions that made permanent settlement and farming desirable. The temple came before the city. Belief came before bread. And there's evidence to support this wild idea. Göbekli Tepe was in continuous use for about 1,500 years. During that time, the structures got gradually more sophisticated. Later phases show evidence of more advanced construction techniques, more elaborate carvings. But they also show something else. As time went on, the pillars got smaller. The craftsmanship remained excellent, but the scale decreased. By the final phases of occupation, around 8000 BCE, the structures were still impressive, but notably less monumental than the earliest ones. At the same time, in the same region, we start seeing the first clear evidence of agriculture. Domesticated strains of wheat and barley appear. Settlements become more permanent. And interestingly, as agriculture takes hold and settlements grow, Göbekli Tepe starts being deliberately buried. Not abandoned. Buried. Someone, for reasons we can only guess at, made the decision to fill in the structures with thousands of tons of dirt and rubble. It was an enormous undertaking, probably requiring as much labour as the original construction. They weren't destroying it. They were preserving it, entombing it, creating what archaeologists call a time capsule that would remain undisturbed for 10,000 years. Why would they do this? Maybe the transition to agricultural life represented such a fundamental shift in worldview that the old sacred site no longer fit their understanding of the cosmos. Maybe new religious ideas replaced the old ones, and burying Göbekli Tepe was a way of honouring the past while moving into a new future. Or maybe, as settlements grew and became more permanent, the mobility required to maintain a regional pilgrimage site became impractical. The temple had served its purpose. It had brought people together, fostered the social connections that made permanent settlement possible. Now that everyone was living in villages year-round, the seasonal gathering place was no longer needed. Whatever the reason, the burial was clearly intentional and ceremonial, and it preserved the site perfectly for modern archaeologists to discover and puzzle over. But here's what really blows minds. Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Since its discovery, archaeologists have identified dozens of similar sites across southeastern Turkey and the northern Levant. None quite as old or as spectacular as Göbekli Tepe, but all showing the same basic pattern. Pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers building ceremonial structures with carved pillars and elaborate symbolic imagery. There was a whole culture of temple builders across this region during the pre-pottery Neolithic period. A civilization, if we can call it that, built on shared beliefs rather than shared grain stores. Sites like Karahan Tepe, Navali Chori and Habetsuvan Tepe all show similar T-shaped pillars, similar animal carvings, similar circular structures. The details vary, but the underlying pattern is consistent. Between about 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, something profound was happening in this corner of the world. People were gathering in unprecedented numbers for ceremonial purposes. They were building monuments that required sophisticated organization and massive labor investment. They were creating art that suggests complex symbolic thinking and possibly sophisticated mythology. And they were doing all of this before they'd figured out how to grow a single kernel of wheat. This tells us something profound about the human mind and human society during this crucial period. The cognitive revolution that allowed symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, and complex language wasn't a sudden development. By 12,000 years ago, humans had already been behaviorally modern for tens of thousands of years. We'd been creating art, developing complex tools, and living in sophisticated social networks for millennia. What changed wasn't our brains. What changed was our circumstances and our choices about how to organize ourselves. Göbekli Tepe shows us that pre-agricultural people weren't simple or primitive. They were capable of abstract thought, sophisticated enough to conceive of sacred spaces and divine forces. They were capable of social organization complex enough to mobilize hundreds of workers for projects that wouldn't be completed in a single lifetime. They were capable of artistic expression refined enough to create imagery that still resonates 11,600 years later. They had engineering, knowledge sophisticated enough to move 20-ton stones and erect them in precise patterns. They had the planning ability to conceive of multi-generational building projects and the cultural continuity to see those projects through. In other words, they had all the cognitive and social capabilities necessary for civilization. What they didn't have was agriculture. And Göbekli Tepe suggests that maybe they built civilization first and then invented agriculture to support it, not the other way around. This is the piece of the puzzle that makes the sudden emergence of civilizations 12,000 years ago make sense. We weren't waiting for some magical cognitive breakthrough. We weren't waiting for our brains to evolve new capabilities. We were waiting for the right combination of circumstances: the climate warming after the Younger Dryas, the recovery of plant and animal populations, the social networks established through ceremonial gatherings, the shared belief systems that gave people reasons to cooperate on unprecedented scales. When all those factors came together in the right place at the right time, humans who already had all the necessary cognitive tools were ready to make the leap. From mobile bands to permanent settlements, from seasonal gatherings to cities, from temple complexes built by volunteers to civilizations built on agriculture. Göbekli Tepe stands at the hinge point of that transformation, a monument to what humans could do before agriculture, and a catalyst for everything that came after. But here's where we need to ask a really uncomfortable question. If humans were already smart enough to build civilizations 12,000 years ago, why didn't we build them sooner? Because here's the thing: the people who constructed Göbekli Tepe, who domesticated wheat, who founded the first cities, they weren't more intelligent than their ancestors from 70,000 years ago. Anatomically, cognitively, they were basically identical. Same brain size, same neural architecture, same capacity for abstract thought and symbolic reasoning. We know this because of what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, the full package of cognitive abilities that separate humans from every other species on the planet. The capacity for art, symbolic thinking, complex tool-making, abstract reasoning, all the mental capabilities you need to build a civilization. And the evidence is overwhelming. Our ancestors had these abilities for tens of thousands of years before they used them to create cities and states. Consider the art. In caves across Europe and Asia, paintings dating back 40,000 years show stunning artistic sophistication. Horses depicted in mid-gallop, bison rendered with perfect anatomical accuracy, abstract symbols that might represent early counting systems or astronomical observations. The people who created these weren't primitive. They understood perspective, movement, symbolism. They could plan complex multi-stage projects, coordinate group efforts, teach skills across generations. Then there's the archaeology from Africa. Sites in South Africa show evidence of abstract art, personal ornaments, and complex tool technologies dating back 70,000 years, maybe longer. Shell beads strung into necklaces, ochre used for body painting, carefully crafted bone tools designed for specific purposes. This is the full cognitive package. Everything you'd need to organize a complex society, create agriculture, build permanent settlements. But they didn't. For 60,000 years after developing behavioral modernity, humans kept living in small bands, kept moving with the seasons, kept hunting and gathering instead of farming. Why? What was missing? The answer isn't about individual intelligence, it's about social technology, the invisible infrastructure that allows humans to cooperate in large numbers with people they're not related to. Because here's the fundamental problem with scaling up human societies. Evolution designed us to live in small groups. Your brain evolved to keep track of about 150 individuals. That's what anthropologists call Dunbar's number. The maximum size of a social network where everyone knows everyone else, where relationships are personal, where cooperation emerges naturally from kinship and repeated interaction. For most of human history, we lived in groups well below this limit. Bands of 20, 30, maybe 50 people. Extended families where everyone was related, where trust was automatic, where you didn't need complex rules or institutions to maintain social order. Your mother's brother was your uncle, his daughter was your cousin. You'd known them your entire life. You'd share food with them not because of some abstract moral principle, but because they were family. But this kind of social organization has hard limits. Try to put 1,000 people together, even 500, and the whole system breaks down. Too many strangers, too many opportunities for cheating and free-riding, too much complexity for personal relationships to manage. You need something else, some way to make strangers cooperate, to make people who've never met trust each other enough to trade, to work together, to build something larger than a family group. This is where the real revolution happened, not in our brains, but in our social technologies. The invisible innovations that allowed humans to scale up from bands to tribes, from tribes to chiefdoms, from chiefdoms to states. And these innovations didn't happen all at once. They accumulated slowly, generation by generation, each building on the last, until around 12,000 years ago they reached a critical mass that made civilization possible. The first innovation was fictive kinship, the idea that you could treat someone like family even if they weren't actually related to you. This might sound simple, but it's actually a massive cognitive leap. You're creating social bonds based on shared concepts rather than biological reality. Calling someone brother when they're not your brother. Treating someone like a sister when she's not your sister. Archaeological evidence suggests this started during the population expansions after the bottleneck. As human groups spread and multiplied, they needed ways to maintain connections with distant relatives, groups that hadn't seen each other for generations but still considered themselves part of the same people. They did this through elaborate kinship systems that extended family bonds far beyond immediate biological relationships. Your father's cousin's daughter became your sister. The son of your mother's uncle became your brother. These weren't just polite terms. They carried real obligations, real expectations of cooperation and mutual aid. But fictive kinship could only scale so far. Eventually groups grew large enough that even extended kinship networks couldn't encompass everyone. That's when the second major innovation emerged. Shared myths, stories that bound people together not through blood relationships, but through common beliefs and origins. The anthropological record shows this happening in stages. First came totems, the idea that your group descended from a particular animal or natural feature. You're all children of the bear or the eagle or the river. This creates a shared identity that transcends individual families. Then came origin stories, elaborate myths about how your people came to be, where you came from, why you're different from other groups. These stories did something remarkable. They created imaginary communities, groups united not by actual relationships, but by shared beliefs. You could meet a complete stranger, and if they knew the same origin story, believed in the same totem, you'd treat them like family. Not biological family, but something almost as strong, cultural family. This is when language became absolutely critical, not just for communication, but for transmitting complex abstract concepts across time and space. The stories had to be memorable, repeatable, consistent enough that someone hearing them in one valley would recognize them in another valley 100 miles away. This required sophisticated linguistic abilities, the capacity for narrative, metaphor, symbolic reasoning, the ability to encode social rules and cultural values in story form so they could be passed down across generations without writing. And the stories were doing something else, something that would prove crucial for the development of civilization. They were creating abstract concepts that had no physical reality but enormous social power, property, debt, rights, territory. None of these things exist in the physical world. You can't touch property, you can't see debt. They're mental constructs, shared fictions that only work if everyone agrees to believe in them. But once you have these concepts, once everyone accepts them, they become as real as stone and wood. Consider property. For most of human history, the idea that someone could own a piece of land would have been incomprehensible. Land was just there. You used it when you needed it, moved on when you didn't. The idea that you could claim exclusive rights to a territory you weren't currently using, that you could exclude others from resources they needed. This required a massive conceptual shift. You had to imagine an abstract relationship between a person and a place that persisted even when the person wasn't present, and everyone in your group had to accept this imaginary relationship as binding. The archaeological record shows this concept emerging gradually during the late Paleolithic. Territorial markers start appearing. Stone cairns, carved posts, painted rocks that seem to delineate boundaries. Sites show evidence of long-term occupation, not just seasonal camps, but places people return to year after year, generation after generation. This suggests they were beginning to think of specific territories as belonging to their group, is something they had rights to, something worth defending. With property came debt. If you can own things, you can owe things. Someone helps you out during a hard season, you now owe them something in the future. Not immediately, maybe not for years, but the debt persists as a social fact that everyone recognizes. This allowed for much more complex economic relationships. You could have trade networks spanning hundreds of miles, gift exchanges that took years to complete, elaborate systems of reciprocity that bound groups together across vast distances. But tracking all these obligations, all these abstract relationships, required cognitive tools that didn't exist yet. You couldn't write anything down. You had to keep everything in memory, maintain complex mental accounting of who owed what to whom. This is where some truly ingenious social innovations emerged. Tally sticks, pieces of wood or bone with notches carved to represent quantities, shell beads that could be exchanged to settle debts, elaborate ceremonial systems where public gift-giving created social obligations that everyone witnessed and remembered. Some archaeologists think this is actually where art came from. Not just decoration, but information storage. The abstract symbols in Paleolithic caves might be recording systems, ways of tracking resources, territories, obligations. The shell beads weren't just pretty, they were currency, stored value that could be exchanged to settle complex social debts. The ceremonial objects found in ancient burials weren't just grave goods, they were markers of social relationships, physical representations of abstract concepts like status, obligation, and belonging. This is what anthropologists call the ratchet effect. Each generation adds small innovations to the cultural toolkit. Nothing revolutionary by itself, but each new technique, each new concept, makes the next innovation possible. You develop fictive kinship, which allows larger groups. Larger groups need shared myths, which require sophisticated language. Complex language enables abstract concepts like property and debt. Property and debt create the need for recording systems. Recording systems allow for more complex trade networks. Trade networks create new selection pressures for social innovations. And all of this is happening simultaneously across human populations worldwide. Not everyone inventing the same things, but different groups developing different solutions to similar problems. Some groups emphasize elaborate kinship systems. Others develop complex ritual traditions. Some create sophisticated trade networks. Others develop proto-writing systems for tracking resources. But they're all solving the same fundamental challenge. How do you make strangers cooperate? How do you scale up human society beyond the natural limits of kinship and personal relationships? The genetic evidence shows something fascinating during this period. Human populations are growing exponentially after the last ice age, from a few 100,000 worldwide to millions within just a few thousand years. This demographic explosion created intense pressure for social innovation. More people meant more strangers, more potential for conflict, more need for systems to organize and coordinate behavior. Groups that developed effective social technologies thrived and expanded. Groups that didn't were absorbed or pushed into marginal territories. But population growth also made civilization necessary. Once you have a certain density of people, you can't just move to a new territory when resources get scarce. Everywhere is occupied. You have to figure out how to make your current territory produce more food, support more people. This is the demographic trap that forced the agricultural revolution. Not desire for easier lives, but population pressure that made intensive food production necessary for survival. And with agriculture came something that would fundamentally reshape human society: inequality. For hundreds of thousands of years, human societies had been relatively egalitarian, not perfectly equal, but without major power hierarchies. Everyone had basically the same stuff because nobody could accumulate much. You can't hoard food that spoils in a few days. You can't own land you're not currently using. Status came from personal qualities like hunting skill, knowledge, or social connections, but it didn't translate into lasting power or wealth. Agriculture changed everything. Suddenly you could accumulate surplus, grain that could be stored for years, land that produced reliable yields, generation after generation, and most importantly, some people could control access to these resources while others worked to produce them. The archaeological record shows this transition happening rapidly once agriculture begins. Early farming villages show little evidence of inequality. Everyone lives in similar houses, eats similar foods, has similar grave goods, but within a few thousand years you start seeing dramatic differences. Big houses and small houses, elaborate burials with massive amounts of grave goods next to simple burials with nothing. Evidence of specialized craftspeople who don't produce their own food, meaning someone else is feeding them. This wasn't just about material wealth, it was about power, the ability to coordinate and control other people's behavior. The earliest proto-states show evidence of this in their recording systems, not writing yet, but increasingly sophisticated methods of tracking resources. Clay tokens representing sheep, grain, tools, sealed containers with markings indicating contents and ownership. These weren't personal memory aids, they were administrative tools, systems for managing resources and labor on a scale that exceeded any individual's ability to track mentally. Some of the earliest examples come from the Middle East around 10,000 years ago. Clay tokens in various shapes, each representing different commodities. A sphere meant a measure of grain. A cylinder meant an animal. A cone meant a small measure of grain. These tokens could be sealed in clay envelopes with markings on the outside indicating the contents. This was crucial because it allowed for accounting, for tracking resources over time and ensuring everyone fulfilled their obligations. It's not writing yet, but it's the infrastructure that makes writing necessary. Once your economic system gets complex enough, you need better recording methods, and that's the thing about all these innovations. None of them alone created civilization, but together, accumulated over thousands of generations, they created the social infrastructure that made civilization possible. By 12,000 years ago, humans had fictive kinship systems that could bind thousands of people together, shared myths that created common identities across vast territories, abstract concepts of property and debt that allowed complex economic relationships, proto-writing systems for tracking resources and obligations, demographic pressures that made intensive agriculture necessary, and emerging hierarchies that could coordinate labor on unprecedented scales. The cognitive capacity had been there for 60,000 years, but the social technology, the invisible infrastructure of concepts and institutions and recording systems that took time to accumulate, each generation adding small innovations, solving immediate problems, not realizing they were building the foundation for something unprecedented. Until around 12,000 years ago, when everything finally reached critical mass, when all the pieces were finally in place, and humans suddenly, explosively, built the first civilizations. Not because we got smarter, but because we finally developed the social technologies to make our intelligence work at scale. So agriculture happened. Humans figured out how to plant seeds, domesticate animals, and produce their own food instead of chasing it across the landscape. Problem solved, right? Everyone settles down, plants some wheat, and lives happily ever after. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. Because here's the thing about the agricultural revolution. It didn't just change how humans got food, it triggered a cascade of transformations, each one building on the last, each one making the next step almost inevitable. Within just a few thousand years, humans went from small seasonal camps to permanent villages, to towns, to cities, to states with armies, bureaucracies, and kings who claimed divine authority. And once that cascade started, there was no stopping it. No going back. Let's trace how it happened, step by step, domino by domino, because the progression isn't just interesting, it's inevitable. Once you set certain forces in motion, civilization becomes almost unavoidable. The first step was simple, seasonal camps becoming permanent villages. For most of human history, people moved, not randomly wandering, but following predictable patterns. Winter camps in protected valleys, summer camps near good hunting grounds, seasonal movements following animal migrations or plant harvests. Your stuff had to be portable. Your social structures had to be flexible. Your commitments to place were temporary. But once you're growing crops, that changes. You can't plant wheat in April and then wander off for 6 months. You need to be there to weed, to protect the fields from animals, to harvest at exactly the right time. Agriculture ties you to specific pieces of ground. The earliest permanent settlements appear around 10,000 BCE, right as the agricultural revolution is getting started. Small at first, maybe a few dozen people living in simple structures made of mud brick, wood and stone. But permanent, year-round occupation, real houses instead of temporary shelters, and that permanence changed everything. When you live in the same place year after year, you can accumulate things. Storage pits for grain that would have been impossible to transport, heavy grinding stones for processing cereals, clay pots for cooking and storage that would have shattered if you tried to carry them hundreds of miles. Suddenly you can own more than you can carry, which means you can own more than your neighbours. By 9000 BCE, places like Jericho in the Jordan Valley had grown to about 2,000 people. 2,000 living in one place. That's not a camp anymore. That's not a band of related families. That's a village with social complexity that would have been impossible for mobile hunter-gatherers. Jericho had stone walls, massive defensive structures that required coordinated labour from hundreds of people. Someone had to design them. Someone had to organise the work crews. Someone had to have the authority to tell people, yes, you need to spend weeks hauling stones instead of tending your own fields. This is the first crack in the egalitarian social structure that had defined human existence for 290,000 years. Mobile hunter-gatherers tend to be relatively equal. You can't accumulate much wealth when you have to carry everything. You can't dominate your neighbours when they can just walk away. But sedentary agriculturalists, they're stuck. Their fields, their stored grain, their houses, they can't just leave. And that creates opportunities for some individuals to accumulate more than others. The archaeological evidence from these early villages shows exactly how it happened. Some houses are bigger than others. Some burials contain more grave goods. Some families clearly had more resources, more status, more power. Food storage was the key. When you're a hunter-gatherer, you eat what you catch or gather that day. Maybe preserve some meat for a few weeks if you're lucky. But agriculturalists can store grain for months, even years. Surplus food that can be protected, controlled, traded, and whoever controls the surplus controls everything. By 7,500 BCE, settlements like Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey had reached 8,000 people, 8,000 individuals living in densely packed mud brick houses, built so close together that people entered through holes in the roof. The whole settlement was like a honeycomb of humanity, pressed together in ways that would have seemed insane to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. And the social complexity had exploded. Çatalhöyük had specialized craftspeople. Not everyone was farming anymore. Some people spent their days making pottery, others weaving textiles, others creating elaborate artwork for the ritual buildings scattered throughout the settlement. These specialists weren't producing their own food. They were trading their skills for shares of the agricultural surplus produced by others. This is revolutionary. For the first time in human history, you could make a living doing something other than acquiring food. You could be an artist, a craftsperson, a religious specialist, as long as the farmers produced enough surplus to support you. But specialization created dependency. The potter needs the farmer's grain. The farmer needs the potter's storage vessels. The weaver needs both of them. Suddenly you can't just walk away from your community because you need the network of exchange relationships that keeps everyone fed, clothed, and equipped. Social bonds that had been based on kinship and personal relationships were being replaced by economic relationships between people who might not even know each other. A farmer trading grain to a potter 3 houses over, who trades a pot to a weaver who makes cloth for someone else entirely. This is the beginning of market economics, of complex exchange systems that transcend personal relationships. And with that complexity came the need for rules, for authority, for someone to mediate disputes and enforce agreements. The first elites were probably religious specialists. The archaeological evidence shows elaborate ritual buildings in most early agricultural settlements, places where people gathered for ceremonies, where specialists performed rituals that supposedly ensured good harvests, healthy children, protection from disaster. Religion was probably the first institution that could claim authority over large groups of unrelated individuals. The shaman, the priest, the ritual specialist had power not because they were the biggest or strongest, but because they supposedly had connections to supernatural forces that everyone feared and depended on. But religion wasn't the only source of centralized authority. Water management was even more important. Because here's something people don't usually think about when they imagine the agricultural revolution. Farming isn't just planting seeds and waiting for rain. Not if you want reliable, large-scale food production. You need irrigation, channels to bring water from rivers to fields, dikes to protect against flooding, reservoirs to store water for dry seasons, and irrigation requires coordination. One farmer can't build a canal system. You need dozens, hundreds of people working together, planning where the channels will go, organizing the labor to dig them, maintaining them year after year, resolving disputes about who gets water when. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this became absolutely critical. The rivers flooded unpredictably, sometimes catastrophically. Growing crops meant controlling the water, channeling it, storing it, distributing it systematically. By 5000 BCE, settlements in southern Mesopotamia had developed sophisticated irrigation systems that required centralized management. Not just individual farmers making decisions about their own fields, but organized bureaucracies that planned and controlled water distribution across entire regions. And whoever controlled the water controlled everything: food production, trade, power. The first cities emerged from this need for coordination. Not just big villages, but genuine urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, with monumental architecture, with clear social hierarchies, with specialized districts for different economic activities. Uruk, the world's first real city, reached 40,000 people by 3200 BCE. 40,000 individuals living in one place, most of them doing specialized work that had nothing to do with food production. Craftspeople, merchants, priests, administrators, laborers working on monumental building projects, all of them dependent on the agricultural surplus produced by farmers in the surrounding countryside. And that surplus had to be tracked. Who owed what to whom? How much grain was stored in the temple warehouses? How much should be distributed to the workers building the ziggurat? How much should be traded to neighboring cities for copper and timber that weren't available locally? This is when writing appeared, around 3400 BCE in Mesopotamia. Not to record poetry or history or religious texts, those came later. The first writing was purely economic. Clay tablets with marks indicating quantities of grain, numbers of sheep, amounts of wool. Writing wasn't invented to express human creativity or preserve knowledge. It was invented to track economic transactions in societies that had become too complex for anyone to keep track of in their heads. And once you have writing, you have the possibility of law, of contracts, of permanent records that transcend individual memory, the foundation of true state-level organization. But there was another force driving the centralization of authority, something darker and more urgent than irrigation management or economic coordination. Warfare. Agricultural settlements were rich. They had stored grain, livestock, valuable goods produced by specialists. And they were stationary. They couldn't run away, which made them targets for raids from nomadic groups or from other agricultural settlements that wanted to expand their territory and resources. The archaeological record from this period is full of evidence of violence, defensive walls getting bigger and more sophisticated, mass graves showing signs of violent death, weapons becoming more specialized and deadly, villages that were burned and abandoned, their population scattered or killed, and warfare, more than anything else, requires centralized authority. You can't organize a defense with everyone making individual decisions. You need commanders who can give orders and expect them to be followed. You need the ability to mobilize large groups quickly. You need to stockpile weapons, train warriors, build and maintain defensive structures. The first kings probably emerged as war leaders, individuals who could organize and command large groups in defense or in raids against neighbors. Their authority was based on their ability to provide protection, to organize violence effectively. And once you have kings, you have states, political entities that claim territory, control populations, make laws, raise armies, collect taxes. The final step in the cascade from seasonal camps to civilization. By 3000 BCE, city-states had emerged across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. Political entities with populations in the hundreds of thousands, with complex bureaucracies, standing armies, monumental architecture that proclaimed their power and permanence. These weren't just big villages. These were fundamentally different forms of social organization. States have monopolies on legitimate violence. They have legal systems that apply to everyone in their territory. They have specialized institutions, temples, palaces, armies, courts. They extract resources from their populations through taxation and use those resources to maintain their power and pursue their interests. And here's the really important thing. Once this cascade started, it was almost impossible to reverse. You can't go back to hunting and gathering once you've grown dependent on agriculture. The wild resources have been depleted. The knowledge of how to live as mobile foragers has been lost. The population has grown too large to support through hunting and gathering. You're locked in. You can't go back to village-level organization once you've built irrigation systems that require centralized management. Who's going to maintain the canals if everyone just decides to be independent? The whole system collapses without coordination. You can't abandon defensive structures once your neighbors have them. If you tear down your walls and they keep theirs, you're vulnerable. The logic of security competition locks everyone into military organization and centralized authority. This is what scholars call path dependency. Once you start down certain roads, the costs of turning back become so high that you just keep going, even if the destination isn't necessarily what anyone would have chosen if they'd known where it was leading. Did the first farmers at Göbekli Tepe imagine their descendants would live in cities of 40,000 people, ruled by kings who claimed divine authority, forced to pay taxes and serve in armies? Probably not. But each small step seemed reasonable at the time. Plant a few crops to supplement wild foods, stay in one place a little longer each year, build a storage facility to protect the surplus, cooperate with neighbors to dig an irrigation channel, appoint someone to manage the water distribution, build walls to protect against raids, grant authority to war leaders to organize defense. Each step logical, each step offering immediate benefits, each step making the next step more likely. more necessary, more inevitable. And suddenly, just a few thousand years after humans first started planting seeds, civilization had emerged, not in one place, not as one event, but independently in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica. Everywhere that agriculture took hold, the same cascade followed, villages to towns to cities to states. The question wasn't whether civilization would emerge once agriculture started. The question was how long it would take. The answer, not long at all. Just a few thousand years from the first permanent settlements to the first states with writing, kings, armies, and bureaucracies. In evolutionary terms, in the vast sweep of human history, that's nothing. A blink, an eye blink that transformed everything about how humans lived, worked, organized themselves, and understood their place in the world. And there was no going back. The door had closed. Humans had built civilizations, and civilizations would build everything that came after. So here we are, at the end of this journey through the most dramatic transformation in human history. 12,000 years ago, after 290,000 years of living essentially the same way, everything changed. Within just a few thousand years, we went from small nomadic bands following animal herds to living in permanent settlements, planting crops, domesticating animals, building temples, and eventually cities. The question is why? What really caused this sudden explosion of civilization? And here's the uncomfortable truth. There's no single answer, no magic bullet that explains everything. It wasn't just climate change, though the end of the Ice Age and the Holocene optimum certainly created opportunities. It wasn't just the Younger Dryas impact, though that catastrophe likely accelerated changes already underway. It wasn't just agriculture, though domestication fundamentally altered human society. It wasn't just cognitive development, though our capacity for symbolic thinking made civilization possible. It was all of these things, a convergence, multiple factors coming together at exactly the right time in exactly the right way. Think of it like a combination lock. You need every number in the correct sequence or the door stays closed. Climate stability, surplus food production, population pressure, technological innovation, social complexity, symbolic thinking. Remove any one of these factors and civilization might never have emerged when it did. Or maybe it would have emerged somewhere else, some other time, in some other form. But there's something else we need to acknowledge. Something that doesn't make it into most history books. This transformation wasn't universally positive. We like to think of civilization as progress, as humanity ascending to something better. But the archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. Those early farmers, they were shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They had more cavities, more bone diseases, more evidence of nutritional deficiencies. Their skeletons show signs of harder physical labor and more repetitive stress injuries. They were working longer hours for a less varied diet, trading the freedom of nomadic life for the security of stored grain, exchanging small egalitarian bands where everyone knew everyone for larger stratified societies where inequality became inevitable. The first civilizations brought writing and monumental architecture and complex technologies, but they also brought slavery, warfare, epidemic disease, and oppression. For every step forward, there was a cost, a trade-off that our ancestors made, probably without fully understanding what they were giving up or what they were gaining. But they made those choices because they had to, because the world was changing and standing still meant extinction. Because once some groups adopted agriculture and started multiplying, everyone else had to adapt or be displaced. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history. Rapid technological and social change forcing everyone to transform or be left behind. And that brings us to the real lesson of this story. What these 12,000 years reveal about human nature, about our species' fundamental character. We are adaptable. Incredibly, almost terrifyingly adaptable. We survived a genetic bottleneck that reduced our ancestors to barely over 1,000 breeding individuals. We endured the worst climate disasters in human history. We figured out how to live in every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high-altitude mountains. And when conditions changed, when opportunity presented itself, we transformed our entire way of life in less time than it takes a single generation to pass. That capacity for rapid change is written into our DNA. It's what makes us human. It's why we're the only survivor of multiple human species, why we're the ones who inherited the Earth. But here's what should really keep us up at night. We might be living through another transformation of similar magnitude right now. Think about it. The agricultural revolution took thousands of years to spread across the globe. The industrial revolution took centuries. The digital revolution has happened in decades. And whatever's coming next, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate change forcing massive adaptations, it's happening in real time. Within our lifetimes, our descendants might look back at this period the way we look back at Göbekli Tepe, as the moment when everything changed, when humanity crossed another threshold and became something new, something our ancestors wouldn't quite recognize. The question is whether we can guide that transformation, or whether it'll happen to us the way agriculture happened to those hunter-gatherers, whether we'll make conscious choices or just react to forces beyond our control. But if there's one thing this history teaches us, it's that humans don't just survive change. We drive it. We shape it. We turn catastrophe into opportunity and scarcity into innovation. Our ancestors did it 12,000 years ago, and we're their descendants. We carry their adaptability in every cell of our bodies. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. Hit that like button if this journey through human history resonated with you. And if you want more deep dives into the mysteries of our past, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Understanding where we came from, how we got here, the challenges our ancestors faced and overcame. It's not just academic curiosity, it's a roadmap, a reminder that humans have always been capable of extraordinary transformation when circumstances demanded it. We've done it before. We can do it again. Sweet dreams, and thanks for joining me on this journey through time.